when a middle-aged widow unearths a stack of unsent letters hidden in her late husband's desk. She initially thinks they're nothing more than nostalgic keepsakes. But as she reads the faded ink on each page, one revelation changes everything, prompting her and her daughter to embark on a journey across the world, searching for answers in a past that spans decades. Before we dive into this unfolding story, let us know where you're reading from. And if you believe in the power of unspoken words to shape our destinies, be sure to give this tale a like and subscribe for more. Margaret Taylor stood alone in the small study, enveloped by the hush that often follows a funeral. Only 2 days had passed since she had buried her husband, Jim, and already the house felt unearthly quiet, as though the usual rhythms of daily life had ground to a halt. Sunlight filtered through closed curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. She could not stop staring at Jim's empty desk, a battered wooden fixture that had once been his cherished sanctuary, where he paid bills, wrote in a small diary, and occasionally jotted down half-finished poems he never shared with anyone. In years past, Margaret had barely glanced at that desk. She respected Jim's sense of privacy, the barrier between them unspoken but mutual. But now, with his passing, the barrier no longer existed. She felt an odd mix of guilt and compulsion, as if rummaging through his desk might violate an unspoken promise, yet also believing that perhaps he intended for her to find whatever secrets he had left behind. Gently, she pulled the desk's central drawer open. Pencils, a box of paper clips, yellowed receipts, and a battered checkbook greeted her. Nothing significant. She tugged at the side drawers next, discovering old greeting cards, utility statements, a scattering of foreign coins from Jim's travels. It all felt mundane, until she noticed a thin wooden panel at the back of the bottom drawer that seemed misaligned. Margaret's heart fluttered with a rush of something like apprehension. She hesitated before reaching in, sliding her fingertips along the panel's edge. It shifted with a soft creak. Behind it lay a hidden compartment stuffed with a stack of letters, their envelopes battered, edges yellowed. Each envelope bore a single name, Lynn, written in Jim's unmistakable slanting script. Margaret froze, unsure what she had uncovered. She knew that Jim had served in Vietnam during the war. He had left as a young man, returning different, quieter. But never, in all the years of their marriage, had he mentioned a woman named Lynn. She wondered if Lynn had been a friend, a nurse, or merely a memory. The hush of the house pressed against her ears, and she took a quivering breath before lifting out the letters. One by one, she flipped them over. None had stamps or postmarks. They had never been mailed. That realization chilled her. Why keep dozens of unsent letters for decades? She could not quell her curiosity. Carefully, she slid one envelope open and extracted a single page. Her eyes roved over the words. They were intimate, confessions of longing, regret, a hope that perhaps one day Lynn might forgive him. He spoke of their son. Margaret's knees buckled, and she gripped the desk for support. Jim had a son with this woman? A child he apparently abandoned when forced to leave Vietnam? Margaret felt as if the walls were closing in. With trembling hands, she flipped to another letter, scanning a block of text. I tried to find you. I sent money, asked old contacts, but everything vanished into the void. I was afraid you hated me, or that you had moved on. But I never stopped loving you. I never forgot our boy. A flurry of emotions pummeled her. Disbelief, shock, betrayal. How could Jim keep this secret for so many years? They had been married nearly 4 decades, raised a daughter, Emma, who was now 30. How had he lived each day, carrying the knowledge of another family across the world? She stood there for a long moment, letters clutched to her chest, breath uneven. Eventually, she placed them carefully atop the desk, as though they were fragile relics. She then hurried to find Emma, who was upstairs in her childhood bedroom, sorting boxes of photographs. Emma, a thoughtful woman with her father's green eyes, had been mourning in her own way, sifting through old pictures, reminiscing about the father who always seemed slightly haunted. Emma had loved Jim wholeheartedly but sensed a perpetual sorrow within him, though she never understood its source. When Margaret entered the room, Emma glanced up. "Mom," Margaret's expression must have been dire. Her hands shook. "I need to show you something," she whispered. They went downstairs, returned to the desk, and Emma saw the letters. For the next hour, mother and daughter pored over Jim's hidden correspondence. Each page revealed pieces of a love story he had kept locked away. The letters spanned decades, from the 1970s to as recently as 6 months earlier. Some were barely half a page, filled with raw longing. "I still see your face in every dream." Others spanned multiple pages detailing his regret. "I promised I would come back for you, but I was too broken, too afraid." Many references to the child. "Our boy. My little Min." Emma's breath caught each time she read those lines. At first, confusion welled in her. "Our boy," she repeated. He had a son in Vietnam? She needed to confirm if Jim's words were literal or figurative, but the letters left no doubt. He spoke of a child he never got to hold, described how the war had ended, and how he was sent home, how bureaucratic chaos and his own fear had prevented him from returning. Guilt weighed on him so heavily that he had never mustered the courage to travel back and find them. Margaret rubbed her forehead, tears gathering. She had believed she knew Jim intimately. Sure, everyone has regrets from youth, but an entire child? Emma felt her own shock morph into heartbreak. "He had this enormous sorrow," Emma murmured. "I sensed it, but I never guessed it was this." They discovered the final letter on the stack, dated only a month before Jim died. It read like a farewell, acknowledging that time was running out, and that if he never got to meet Lynn or their son, he wanted them to know he never stopped loving them. He wrote, "I only hope that one day my family will understand why I had to hide this. I wanted to protect them from my shame." Margaret could not hold back tears. She whispered, "Why didn't he trust me enough to share this? Did he think I'd cast him out? We shared so much, but he never told me." The hurt in her voice was palpable. Emma set the last letter down carefully. She recognized that her father's motivations might have been tangled in fear or in the moral codes of an era. He wrote in another letter that he tried to approach lawyers about searching for them, but it led nowhere. He worried about humiliating Margaret or hurting Emma with the knowledge of a half-brother. So he let the secret fester, year upon year, until it was too late. Mother and daughter sat in silence for a while, the letters resting between them. Margaret stared at a framed photograph on the wall. Jim, leaning against his old sedan, smiling. How different that image felt now. Emma was the one to break the silence. "We have to do something," she said softly. "He wrote all these letters but never mailed them. They deserve to know. Lynn and the son Min. They deserve the truth. Dad died without ever reconciling this." Margaret hesitated. "What do you mean, do something?" "I mean," Emma drew a breath, "we can deliver at least one of these letters. Or find them. Dad's last letter, the one that read like a farewell, belongs in Lynn's hands or their son's. They might wonder all these years what happened to him. Maybe they hated him or maybe they never knew how to reach him. It feels right to give them closure. And maybe we'll find our own closure, too." Margaret's eyes brimmed again. She had not traveled much beyond the country. The idea of going to Vietnam to unearth these ghosts terrified her. "Emma, that's not so simple. We don't even know if they're alive, or where they might be. Vietnam is huge. We have only these letters. It could be hopeless." But Emma's resolve sparkled in her gaze. She flipped through the letters again. Some mentioned a region near Hanoi, others an address in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. Though the letters were never sent. Jim wrote about a small house near a river. The details were sparse but might offer clues. Margaret's heart pounded. She was exhausted from grief. Yet she saw the determination in Emma's posture, recognized a spark of Jim's spirit. Emma had always been the type to chase the truth, no matter how painful. "You really think we should go there, just like that?" Emma nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. "Yes, Mom, I do. For Dad, for them, and for us. He spent his life haunted by this. If we can lay it to rest, maybe we can set him free in some way." Margaret clasped her hands. Her entire being rebelled at the thought of dredging up more heartbreak. But something inside her agreed with Emma's logic. She pictured Jim's final days, his weakened body in the hospital bed, the regrets that seemed to shadow him even then. He might never have said the words, but he yearned for resolution. "All right," Margaret whispered. "All right, let's try." The decision made, Emma leaned forward, pulling out the final letter from the stack. It was carefully sealed in an envelope, labeled "To Lynn or our son, if I cannot find you." Emma's throat constricted. "We'll deliver this," she said. "We'll do what Dad never could." That night, neither of them slept much. Margaret prepared the funeral thank-you notes, tried calling a few relatives to let them know she and Emma were traveling overseas for a while. She gave them an abbreviated version. "Jim had some unresolved matters in Vietnam. We want to pay respects." People were politely baffled. Emma spent her time researching flights, rummaging through the letters for any addresses that might still be relevant. She also found an old address in an ancient phone book of Jim's, referencing a friend from the military who had ties in Vietnam. Maybe that friend would have a clue. By morning, they had a rough plan. Fly to Ho Chi Minh City, see if the addresses lead anywhere. If not, try to track down Jim's old military contacts. They had only a vague timeline, but Emma promised they would figure it out as they went. Margaret was anxious. She had never been one for spontaneous journeys, but something about fulfilling Jim's unspoken wish felt urgent. Within a week, they had plane tickets. The house still carried the hush of mourning. Jim's funeral flowers were wilting in the living room. On the morning of their departure, Margaret paused in the study, gazing at the desk once more. She could almost see Jim's silhouette, hunched over a letter he would never send. She whispered a silent goodbye, tears sliding down her cheeks. Then Emma called from the hallway, urging they not miss their flight. The journey to Vietnam was an exhausting blur of airports, customs lines, and time zone changes. Margaret, in her late 60s, felt the strain keenly. Emma, at 30, was more resilient, though fear gnawed at her as well. On the plane, as the engines roared, they quietly read one of Jim's earliest letters, dated 1972. He wrote, "Lynn, my heart breaks that I have to leave. They said my tour is up, that I'm going back home. But my home is with you. I promise I'll come back." Margaret swallowed a lump of sorrow. Emma squeezed her mother's hand. They both recognized that Jim never fulfilled that promise, and now they were trying, in a sense, to do it on his behalf. They landed in the humid bustle of Tan Son Nhut Airport. The chaos of Ho Chi Minh City, still often referred to as Saigon, wrapped around them. Swarms of motorbikes, neon signs, tangles of overhead wires. The heat pressed in heavy and wet. Emma had booked a small hotel near the city center. They took a taxi there, gazing at the city's swirl of life. Margaret was overwhelmed by the noise, the endless honking, the chatter of vendors. They arrived at the hotel, a modest place with a lobby fan stirring the thick air. After dropping off their luggage, they decided to approach the first address that Jim had mentioned in a letter from the late 1970s, a small district near the river. It was well after lunchtime, but Emma insisted they go right away, unable to bear the tension of waiting. Margaret, fatigued but determined, nodded. A local taxi took them deep into the city's older neighborhoods. Cramped alleys, low-rise buildings, bright laundry hung from balconies. Children played near the sidewalks, and occasional shops sold steaming bowls of pho. The driver eventually stopped at a narrow lane, gesturing that they had arrived. Emma paid him and he sped off. They stood there, uncertain which direction to head, the letter's address clutched in Emma's hand. She tried to read the street signs, many in Vietnamese script. The place had likely changed drastically since the 1970s. They wandered through the lane, showing the address to passers-by. Most responded with kind shrugs, no recognition. Eventually, an elderly woman peered closely, frowned, and said she recalled a family who once lived there decades ago, but they moved away. She pointed them to a corner house. Emma's heart thudded as they approached the house. A faded green paint job, battered shutters. She knocked softly. A middle-aged man answered, polite but perplexed by the foreigners at his door. Through broken English and gestures, Emma explained she was searching for someone named Lynn who might have lived here many years ago. The man's brow furrowed. He had bought this house only 5 years before, had no knowledge of previous owners. He suggested they speak to an older neighbor. So they left, frustration building. The neighbor, an older man with a stooped posture, recognized the name Lynn. He recalled a young woman, half French, half Vietnamese, who had lived with an American soldier at some point. But that had been so long ago, and he was unsure if she was the same Lynn. He thought she might have left for the north or perhaps the countryside. Margaret's shoulders slumped. They thanked him, stepping away with no concrete leads. Despite the disappointment, Emma insisted they not give up. The city had many wards, and they had other references in Jim's letters. Over the next days, they toiled across different districts, speaking to older residents, scanning tattered records in local offices. Sometimes they discovered contradictory hints. Someone claimed Lynn might have run a small tailoring shop in a different part of the city, or possibly moved to Da Nang. It was a labyrinth of half-clues. Margaret grew weary, physically and emotionally. She found herself questioning whether this was futile. But Emma refused to let go. Dad believed she was near here, she kept saying. He wrote that he heard rumors she'd returned to her hometown. Finally, after nearly a week of frustration, they visited an elderly ex-soldier who once dealt with American veterans seeking lost contacts. He peered at Jim's old photos, including one of a younger Jim in uniform standing with a Vietnamese woman. The ex-soldier rubbed his chin, as if recalling something. "Maybe you should check the north," he said in careful English. Hanoi region. Many people from the south migrated or returned home after the war. Emma realized that in one letter, Jim had indeed mentioned Lynn's father was originally from a province near Hanoi. That might be the key. Though traveling from Ho Chi Minh City to Hanoi was another big leap, they decided to do it. They booked a flight. As they left the city's hectic sprawl behind, Margaret privately wondered if they were chasing shadows. She worried about Emma's heartbreak if they never found Lynn or the son, Min. But Emma's conviction remained unwavering. Arriving in Hanoi, they found a city steeped in history, with winding old quarters, tree-lined boulevards of French colonial influence. The air felt cooler than the south, though still muggy. They settled into a modest guesthouse near Hon Kim Lake. Emma resumed the search, diving into local leads, old directories, rummaging through local community centers, paying a small fee to check official records. They faced language barriers, labyrinthine bureaucracy, and archived documents that had been destroyed over time. Margaret grew numb with each disappointment. Then a breakthrough. In one letter from the 1980s, Jim wrote that Lynn might have moved to a small village near the Red River, west of Hanoi, to stay with relatives. So Emma and Margaret hired a driver to take them out of the city along country roads, passing rice paddies and farmland. The driver, a friendly man named Tran, did his best to interpret. They had a copy of an old letter describing a river bend, a row of lotus ponds, and a small temple where villagers prayed. The letter mentioned that Lynn's aunt had a home in that area. After nearly 2 hours, they arrived at a village that matched some of the letter's descriptions. They ventured out, seeking older residents. Many had never heard of Lynn, but an old woman selling vegetables recognized the aunt's name, Phuong. She said Phuong had died years ago, but Lynn might have inherited the property. She pointed them down a narrow path. Emma's pulse quickened. They followed it, heart pounding. At the path's end stood a small, weathered house with clay roof tiles, set near a serene pond. Lotus flowers dotted the water's surface. Emma knocked on the old wooden door. Silence. She knocked again. No response. The windows were shuttered, as if no one lived there. A neighbor ambled over, curious about these strangers. Through Tran's help, they learned that the occupant was indeed named Lynn, but she had gone away a few years ago. The neighbor believed Lynn might have moved closer to the city for better medical care. He remembered a middle-aged man, her son, occasionally visiting, named Min. The name made Margaret's breath catch. That was Jim's son. They were on the right track, at least. But with Lynn no longer living here, the trail felt precarious. The neighbor rummaged for a slip of paper with a phone number for Min. He found a scribbled note in an old drawer. Emma stared at it in awe, tears brimming. They had a contact number. She thanked the neighbor profusely, gave him a small gift in gratitude. Then they retreated to the dusty road, adrenaline surging. That evening, back at the guest house, Emma paced with her phone in hand. She typed the number into her cell, prayed it still worked. She pressed dial. A ring. Another ring. On the third ring, a male voice answered in Vietnamese. Emma's heart hammered. She passed the phone to Tran for interpretation. Tran explained the situation in rapid speech, that foreigners were calling about Lin. The man on the other end grew silent. Then, in halting English, he said, "Who are you? Why do you ask about my mother?" Emma took a breath. "My name is Emma Taylor," she replied, speaking slowly. "My father was Jim Taylor. He wrote letters to your mother, Lin." A long pause. Then the man asked, "Jim Taylor? The American soldier?" Another pause. "I am Min." The moment felt surreal. Emma's mind spun. She struggled to speak. "Yes, was my father. He died last month. We found letters that he never sent. I think you might be his son." She felt tears in her eyes, imagining the shock on the other end of the line. Min said nothing for a length of time. Emma could hear his breath. Then he softly said, "I heard stories. My mother told me once that my father was an American soldier. But I never knew him." His tone carried caution, perhaps an undercurrent of resentment. "Why do you contact me now?" Emma's voice trembled. "He left behind a final letter, for your mother or for you. We wanted to deliver it. He never stopped thinking of you or Lin. He wrote about you both until his death." Another prolonged silence. Min cleared his throat. "Where are you? Are you in Vietnam?" "Yes, we're in Hanoi. We traveled from America to find you, to give you this letter. We want to talk to." Her voice cracked. "We're sorry. He never told us. We only found out after he passed." Min let out a quiet exhale. "I see." He switched to a more fluent English. "My mother is sick. She is at a small clinic near Hanoi. I can meet you, perhaps tomorrow." They arranged a time and place, an intersection near the clinic. Emma thanked him, tears streaming. They ended the call. She collapsed onto the bed, feeling relief, terror, hope. Margaret embraced her. "We did it," Margaret whispered. "We found them." The next morning felt unbearably long as they waited for the scheduled meeting time. Emma was so anxious she could barely eat breakfast. Margaret, equally nervous, tried to remain calm. By midday, they took a taxi to the designated intersection on the outskirts of the city, a modest street lined with small shops. Tran accompanied them as an interpreter just in case. They arrived early, scanning passersby. Emma's heart hammered with each face, wondering if one might be her half-brother. After a tense 15 minutes, a man approached. He was in his early 40s, lean, with an earnest face. He paused a short distance away, studying them. He had Jim's eyes, a similar color, a familiar shape. Emma's breath caught. She raised a hand in a tentative wave. He stepped closer, paused. "Emma?" he asked softly. She nodded, tears forming. "Min." He managed a small nod. Then, awkwardly, he extended a hand. She took it. The handshake lingered. Margaret watched, tears in her own eyes, realizing she was face to face with the son her husband never met. That realization almost buckled her knees. Min's voice trembled. "It's strange to see you. I never thought." He cut himself off. After a breath, he switched to Vietnamese, speaking to Tran. Tran explained that Min was asking to speak more privately, perhaps at a nearby cafe. They agreed. A short walk later, they settled at an outdoor table beneath a leafy tree. The traffic rumbled softly in the background. Emma took out the final letter from her bag, the envelope sealed in Jim's hand. She placed it on the table gently. "This is for you, or for your mother. Dad wrote it about a month before he died. It's the last letter he wrote." Min stared at it, face unreadable. Slowly he picked it up, His hands shook. He parted the envelope. Margaret and Emma exchanged glances, uncertain whether to look away as he read. But he seemed to want them there. For a long stretch, Min read silently. Emma noticed how his eyes misted, how his brow furrowed in pain. Jim's words, no doubt, confessed all the regret that had built up over decades. When he finished, he set the letter down, exhaling shakily. He says he never stopped loving my mother, that he tried to find us, that he was scared to bring shame to his new family. He pressed his lips together. He apologized for abandoning me, for missing my entire childhood. Emma's own tears glimmered. She reached across, laying a hand on his arm. I didn't know. I only discovered everything after he died. She paused. He wrote so many letters to your mother, unsent. And he wrote about you, how he longed to meet you. Min's expression flickered through sorrow, anger, and something like acceptance. He looked at Margaret, trying to piece together the existence of Jim's American wife. Margaret forced a small, sad smile. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. If I had known, I would have encouraged him to find you. She sighed, voice thick. He was a good man, but he carried a hidden guilt. I suppose he thought he was protecting us all from heartbreak. Her voice trembled. That was a mistake. Min nodded, eyes brimming. Then, to Emma's surprise, he reached into his satchel. I have letters too. I wrote them to him once I learned his name. My mother told me about Jim Taylor. But the letters always came back undelivered. Or maybe I had the wrong address. He withdrew a small bundle of tattered pages. I was bitter for a long time. I asked him why he never returned. I wanted him to know I existed, that I had questions. But I never got answers. Seeing those letters hammered Emma's heart. She pictured Jim at home, waiting for a sign, never receiving it. 2 sets of letters, one from father to son, the other from son to father, floating in separate voids. The cruelty of fate was almost too much to bear. Min explained that Lynn was ill, staying at a clinic in a quieter part of town. She had kidney issues and needed regular treatment. She's weak, he murmured. But she's lucid enough to recognize people. If you want to see her. He trailed off uncertainly. Emma's eyes flicked to Margaret, silently asking if she was ready. Margaret, though pale, gave a determined nod. Yes, she whispered. We came this far. They hailed a taxi, driving through winding streets until they reached a small clinic. The courtyard was lined with potted plants, a calm ambience. Min guided them inside. Emma's stomach churned with nerves. Margaret clutched her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. Eventually, they reached a modest room with a single bed. A thin curtain parted. On the bed lay an older woman, hair silvered, face lined with the wear of time. She turned her head, eyes narrowing to see who had come. Min approached, speaking softly in Vietnamese, explaining that these were guests from America with news of Jim Taylor. At the mention of that name, Lynn's eyes shimmered. She tried to push herself upright. A nurse rushed to help. Lynn's voice quavered. Jim? After so many years? She gazed at Emma and Margaret, confusion mixing with a yearning. Emma recognized that the woman, once the love of her father's life, was grappling with a flood of old memories. Min introduced Emma as Jim's daughter. Lynn's lips parted, stunned. She stared at Emma as if searching for traces of Jim's features in her face. Tears glistened. You are his child? She whispered in halting English. Emma nodded, tears choking her. Yes, she managed. He was my father. He passed away recently. We found letters he wrote to you. Margaret stepped forward, voice trembling. I'm Margaret. I was Jim's wife in America for many years. I never knew about you, or about. She trailed off, glancing at Min. He kept it hidden. Her eyes misted. We came to deliver his last letter. To say he never forgot you. The moment hung with electric tension. Lynn's weathered eyes flicked over them both, tears spilling. Then she let out a breath that sounded like a half-choked sob. Jim. I thought maybe he forgot. Or he died long ago. I waited for him once, but he never came back. Then I moved on. I had to survive. But a part of me always wondered. She began to weep. Min gently held her hand. Emma eased forward, kneeling by the bed. She passed the final letter to Lin, the same letter Min had read. Lin accepted it with trembling fingers. Margaret and Emma quietly watched as she read her lost love's words. Her tears fell onto the paper. Her chest quivered with stifled sobs. When she finished, she clutched the letter to her heart, eyes closed, murmuring words in Vietnamese, perhaps prayers or regrets. Then she turned watery eyes on them. He said he was sorry, that he loved me all these years. I never knew he wrote this. She exhaled shakily. I wish we had found each other sooner. For the next hour, they spoke in hushed tones. Min helped interpret. Lin recounted her story. How after Jim left, she tried to contact American agencies, but everything was chaos. She feared retribution from local authorities for fraternizing with an American soldier, so she relocated to relatives in the north. She wrote letters but never heard back. She eventually resigned herself to the idea that Jim had chosen a life in America. She raised Min as best she could, though times were tough. She never remarried, though she had close friends. She admitted that a small part of her always believed Jim might appear one day. But years slipped away, and she grew older, her health failing. Margaret listened, tears silently rolling. She ached for this woman, a mirror of Jim's heartbreak from the other side. Emma asked about the child, Min. He recounted how he grew up hearing only fragments about his American father. He struggled with identity, feeling half belonging, half estranged. He said he wrote letters to the U.S. Embassy trying to find Jim, but never got a response. Over time, he let the bitterness fester. He assumed Jim had willfully abandoned them. Only after seeing the father's letters did he sense it was more complicated. Lin gently took Margaret's hand. I'm sorry. I never wanted to intrude on your life. I think Jim must have been torn. Margaret squeezed back, voice wavering. He was. But he loved us both in different ways. I only wish he had told me. They shared a tearful, bittersweet moment of empathy. These two women, from worlds apart, joined by one man's broken promise. The next day, Emma returned alone, while Margaret rested. She found Min in a corridor brewing tea. They sat, speaking in hushed tones. Emma asked about his life. He was a teacher, living in a small apartment near the outskirts. He visited Lin every week, supporting her medical bills. Emma told him about her childhood. How Jim was a kind father but carried a persistent sadness he never fully explained. They shared quiet tears, lamenting the decades lost. Min led her outside, where they strolled the clinic's small garden. He said he had once fantasized about traveling to America, confronting Jim, demanding answers. But as he aged, that anger mellowed into sorrow. He regretted never meeting him. Emma apologized for her father's failures, though she realized none of it was truly her fault. They agreed that perhaps now, in this improbable union, they could salvage a piece of family. The orchard of regret might bear a new orchard of understanding. Meanwhile, Margaret overcame her trepidation and visited Lin again. The two women, though reliant on Min's interpretation, gradually formed a connection. They pored over old photographs Emma had brought. Jim in his youth, pictures of him holding baby Emma, scenes of vacations. Lin recognized echoes of the man she loved, grown older. She shared her own photos, grainy black and whites of a younger Jim in uniform, hugging Lin, smiling. Margaret's eyes watered seeing that beaming Jim. She realized how war had stolen his chance at happiness, how fear had crippled his choices. In the following days, Emma and Margaret frequently returned to the clinic. They accompanied Lin to her dialysis sessions, helped Min manage errands. They found themselves stepping into a caretaker role, forging a closeness that defied logic. The staff watched curiously as these American strangers and an ailing Vietnamese woman formed a new family bond. Margaret, uncertain at first, discovered she wanted to be there. Lin was the only woman Jim had loved before her. She felt no jealousy now, just compassion for the heartbreak that war inflicted on them all. One afternoon, Lynn confided in them about the last time she had seen Jim. He stood at a makeshift airstrip, hugging her goodbye, tears in his eyes. He promised, "I'll be back." But his voice trembled. She sensed he was uncertain. That was the final memory she carried for decades. She gazed at Emma, tears brimming, and said in halting English, "He left me with love, not hate." The words made Emma's chest tighten. Eventually, Margaret and Emma realized they couldn't stay in Vietnam indefinitely. Margaret's health insurance issues, Emma's job, both needed attending. But they wanted to ensure Lynn received good care. Min, proud and independent, resisted financial help initially. However, Emma explained that Jim would have wanted them to help. She offered to pay for better treatment. Margaret seconded the offer. Min, after some internal struggle, relented. He recognized they all shared the same goal: to honor Jim's memory by caring for Lynn. Before they departed, they proposed a small ceremony, a moment to read Jim's letters aloud to finalize closure. At first, Lynn hesitated but eventually agreed. They arranged it in the clinic courtyard at dusk, the air balmy. A handful of staff and neighbors gathered out of curiosity. Emma picked a few passages from different letters. She read them softly, tears in her voice. Min translated for Lynn. Each letter's confession of longing, each regret-laden paragraph, hung in the heavy evening air. Margaret held Lynn's hand, tears streaming. By the ceremony's end, all were weeping quietly. It felt like a gentle funeral for the love that never got a second chance. Lynn expressed her gratitude to Margaret and Emma, whispering that she felt Jim's spirit at peace now. Margaret nodded, pressing a small rose into Lynn's hand. "I forgive him," Margaret murmured, though more to herself. "And I think he forgave himself in the end." On their last day, Min took them to a small riverside spot near the city. He said Jim always wrote about how he loved the water, how it reminded him of time with Lynn. They scattered a few flower petals on the current, a gesture of farewell. The sun glinted on the ripples, carrying the blooms downstream. Emma closed her eyes, imagining Jim's ashes might have found solace in water like this, bridging the distance. For the first time since his funeral, she felt something like serenity. She prayed that wherever Jim's soul resided, he saw what they were doing. They were weaving together the family he had left fragmented. Finally, the day came to depart. Lynn, still frail, insisted on standing from her bed to embrace them. She pressed a trembling kiss to Margaret's cheek, murmuring thanks. She hugged Emma a bit longer, tears in both their eyes. "Your father, he would be proud of you," she said softly. Emma's throat was tight. "He's proud of all of us," she managed. Min accompanied them to the airport, hugging Emma goodbye. They exchanged phone numbers, promising to keep in touch. Emma vowed to return, or help him visit the States if he wished. Min held her hand, eyes earnest. "We are siblings," he said simply. "Nothing changes that now." As Emma and Margaret boarded the plane, they both felt heavier and lighter at once. Heavy with the knowledge of what Jim lost, yet lighter for having mended some of the wounds he left behind. The flight home was subdued, each lost in reflection. Margaret replayed Lynn's final words, "I never stopped waiting," in my heart. She realized how easily this entire saga could have remained buried had they not found the letters. Back in the States, they returned to a house that felt different. The desk where they found the letters no longer seemed a monument to secrets. Instead, it was a place of truth, a testament to Jim's complicated life. Emma took the letters that Jim wrote, along with the ones Min wrote. She placed them together in a new box labeled Family Legacy. Occasionally, she reread them, tears falling, but no longer from raw pain, rather from a sense of closeness, bridging half a world. Over the following months, they kept in touch with Min and Lynn. Video calls, stilted due to time zones and language barriers, but precious all the same, allowed them to see Lynn's improving health thanks to better support. Margaret would share old family photos, explaining to Lynn the stories behind them. In return, Lynn would show glimpses of her humble living space, the orchard outside her home where she recovered once the clinic discharged her. Min sometimes teased Emma about American pop culture, forging a sibling banter. Emma felt a blossoming affection for this older brother, lamenting that they had missed decades of birthdays, silly fights, paternal guidance. But at least they had now. One evening, Emma found Margaret gazing at Jim's old photograph again, a peaceful smile on her lips. "I used to resent him for hiding this," Margaret confessed. "But I think I understand now. He was so scared that he'd destroy what we had if he confessed. Maybe back then it would have." She inhaled. "But I still wish he had told me. We might have found Lynn and Min a long time ago. Saved everyone so much heartbreak." Emma gently touched her mother's shoulder. "We can't change what he did, but we can change how it ends." Time flowed gently. Emma and Margaret settled into life, hosting barbecues for friends, occasionally explaining that they had a Vietnamese half-brother. Reactions varied from surprise to delight. Some asked if Min would visit. Emma hoped so. Meanwhile, Lynn's condition stabilized, though doctors said she needed ongoing care. They decided to set up a monthly bank transfer for her expenses. Min accepted it with gratitude, seeing it as an extension of the father who never got the chance to provide for them. Margaret found comfort in these gestures, feeling that Jim's memory thrived not in guilt, but in generosity. Eventually, the day came when Min announced he would come to America for a short visit, bringing Lynn if she was healthy enough. They all arranged it for next spring, giving Lynn time to recover more fully. The plan was to have a small memorial ceremony at Jim's grave, acknowledging all branches of his family together. Emma felt nervous yet excited, imagining how neighbors might react to meeting the woman Jim loved in Vietnam so many decades ago. But that was overshadowed by the warmth she felt. This was healing. As the seasons shifted, Emma sometimes sat at her father's desk, writing her own letters to Lynn, to Min, continuing the tradition of heartfelt confessions. She realized letters carry weight beyond mere words. They can connect hearts across oceans, bridging regrets and forging futures. She marveled that a secret stash of letters had reshaped their entire world. On the anniversary of Jim's passing, she and Margaret visited his grave. They brought along a copy of the final letter he wrote to Lynn. Placing it at the base of the headstone, Emma murmured, "We delivered it, Dad. We did what you couldn't. They know you never stopped loving them." Margaret, eyes wet, whispered, "Rest easy, Jim. We found your lost family." A soft breeze rustled the nearby trees, as though in gentle acknowledgement. For a moment, Emma closed her eyes, imagining her father's spirit smiling, free from the burden of secrecy. The hush of the cemetery felt peaceful rather than oppressive. Margaret, voice trembling, said, "He tried to right his wrongs too late, but maybe it's never truly too late. Not if the love remains." In the months that followed, the relationship between these two families on opposite sides of the world blossomed in small, meaningful ways. Emma would call Min over video chat, practicing bits of Vietnamese. He'd respond in English, both stumbling over each other's languages but laughing about it. Sometimes Lynn would appear on screen, shyly smiling, greeting them. Margaret even exchanged recipes with Lynn, American apple pie for Vietnamese spring rolls, spreading cultural warmth. Finally, the day arrived when Min and Lynn arrived at the local airport. Emma and Margaret waited anxiously with flowers. Lynn was frail, leaning on Min's arm, but her face glowed with cautious excitement. The embrace they shared in the arrivals hall was tearful, none of them able to express the swirl of emotions in words. On the drive to Margaret's home, Lynn gazed out at the passing scenery, occasionally remarking on how different the roads were from her home. Min teased her gently, trying to lighten the mood. Margaret had prepared the guest room for them, ensuring every comfort. That evening, they gathered around the dining table, a blend of Vietnamese and American dishes laid out. They laughed about miscommunications, telling stories of Jim's quirks. Emma recounted how he once tried to fix the plumbing and flooded the kitchen. Min told them how he once found an old wallet of Jim's, left behind in that deserted house. They felt Jim's presence in the sharing of these anecdotes. Lynn, at times, would close her eyes and let tears slip as she imagined the husband she never got to have in full measure. But she also smiled, gratitude shining through. The next morning, They visited Jim's grave together. The small memorial ceremony was intimate. Just Emma, Margaret, Lynn, Min, and a few close friends of the family. They brought fresh flowers, a photo of Jim from his youth, and some incense to honor traditions. Min said a few words in Vietnamese, thanking Jim for the life he had given him, the small part of him that thrived. Lynn placed a trembling hand on the headstone, whispering a goodbye she had waited decades to speak. Emma read a short passage from one of Jim's earliest letters. "We may be separated by oceans, but my heart remains with you." The air was thick with emotion, yet it felt like a gentle absolution. They stood in silent unity for a long while, each reconciling the past in their own way. After the ceremony, they returned to the house for a quiet meal. Margaret broke the silence by suggesting they rename the desk in the study the reconciliation desk, half in jest. Everyone chuckled. Emma said it was a good idea. The desk no longer symbolized secrecy but a bridging of hearts. Min smiled softly, acknowledging that from an unsent letter to a reunited family, the desk had been the conduit. During their visit, Lynn and Min spent a couple of weeks in the States, sightseeing a bit, bonding with Emma and Margaret more deeply. Lynn's health wavered, but she managed short walks in the local park. She marveled at the wide American roads, the abundance of supermarkets. Margaret accompanied her, forging a gentle friendship. The language barrier was softened by shared gestures of kindness. Sometimes they laughed about how each mother loved the same man in different times, different ways. It wasn't easy, but it felt healing. On their last night before returning to Vietnam, they sat outside beneath a canopy of stars, reminiscent of how Emma and Jim once stargazed. Lynn recounted a memory of a younger Jim teaching her an American song by humming it off-key. Margaret told stories of Jim's clumsy attempts at do-it-yourself projects. The group's laughter mingled with tears as they realized how many sweet moments that man had spread across the world. Min quietly said, "He was never truly gone from either side of his family." They nodded. In that moment, it felt as if Jim's legacy had found peace in the love that spanned continents. The next morning, Emma and Margaret drove Min and Lynn to the airport. The farewell was tearful but tinged with hope. They promised to keep in touch, to visit Vietnam again soon. Lynn pressed a small embroidered cloth into Margaret's hands, a gift she had sewn. Margaret gifted her a quilt Jim used as a child. The unspoken exchange of items felt symbolic of bridging their histories. Min embraced Emma tightly, calling her his sister. She whispered that she'd always be there for him, that they were family now, no question. As the plane carrying Lynn and Min disappeared into the sky, Emma and Margaret stood at the terminal windows, arms linked. Margaret exhaled a long breath. "We did it," she murmured. Emma nodded, eyes glistening with tears of relief. The memory of Jim's final letter played in her head. His heartfelt apology, his quiet longing. She whispered a silent vow. "We carry your love forward, Dad, beyond all regrets." They drove home in a reflective hush. The house awaited them, no longer weighed down by hidden truths. In the study, the desk stood as it always had, but with a different aura. Emma placed a small photo of Lynn and Min from their trip, standing side by side, next to a photo of Jim. She stepped back, blinking away tears. The family, once separated by decades of war and silence, now coexisted in a single frame, however symbolic. Margaret poured 2 cups of tea. They sat in the living room, gazing at the pictures. "I'm proud of us," Margaret said softly. "And I'm proud of Jim, too, for writing those letters, even if he never sent them. Maybe he was waiting for the right time." Emma nodded. "Yes, and I think we found that time for him." She closed her eyes, picturing Jim's face, the father who taught her to ride a bike, who quietly typed away at his desk at night, who never let on about the other half of his heart. Now, she felt a sense of completeness, as though she had returned a vital piece of his story to where it belonged. In the months that followed, they continued corresponding with Min via video calls, exchanging anecdotes about daily life. Sometimes Lynn joined in, looking healthier, flashing a gentle smile whenever Emma or Margaret tried out a few Vietnamese words. The remnants of bitterness had softened into a mellow acceptance. They had forged a bond in the shadow of Jim's hidden legacy, a bond that felt both fragile and precious. One day, while reorganizing Jim's study further, Emma unearthed a small, locked box. The key was taped underneath the desk. Inside, she found a solitary photograph. Jim, young and in uniform, standing under a tree in Vietnam, one arm around a woman whose face was partially obscured by shadow but unmistakably Lynn. He was beaming, brimming with joy. On the back, in Jim's handwriting, was a single line, "If only time would stop for us." Emma pressed the photo to her heart. That was the father she never fully knew, a man unburdened by guilt in that fleeting moment. She made a copy of the photo, mailing the original to Min and Lynn. Attached was a note. "For all the time that didn't stop, we can still treasure the moment it did." She imagined them smiling, receiving this piece of the past. The thought warmed her soul. Their life moved on, but every so often, a new letter from Min arrived, describing Lynn's continuing recovery or a small family event in their village. Each letter evoked both nostalgia and relief. Margaret found herself replying with updates about their quiet American town, the changing leaves, the new flowers in her garden. She realized that though Jim was gone, his family across the ocean remained as dear to her now as any relative. The unorthodox nature of it no longer mattered. Love, after all, transcended conventional definitions. On the one-year anniversary of their initial trip, Emma and Margaret decided to return to Vietnam. This time, they carried no frantic desperation, only suitcases filled with gifts and hearts open to deeper connection. They spent 2 peaceful weeks there, seeing the daily rhythms of Min's life as a teacher, visiting Lynn's home near the orchard. They discovered a small memory shrine Lynn kept for Jim, pictures, tokens, a pressed flower from his uniform days. They added their own contributions. A small American flag, a lock of Emma's hair wrapped in ribbon, signifying the child he left behind but ultimately reclaimed in spirit. On their final night, gathered around a humble dinner table, the 4 of them shared a meal of blended cuisines, fresh spring rolls alongside apple pie. They laughed at the mismatch, feeling an unspoken synergy. Outside, the night's calm enveloped the orchard. Lynn turned to Margaret and Emma, saying softly, "Thank you for bringing Jim's words to me. I lived many years thinking he forgot. Now I know he never did." Her gaze shifted to Min. "We are a family, even if it took too long to find each other." The tears that followed were gentle, not driven by sorrow but by gratitude. Emma couldn't help but picture Jim watching from whatever afterlife he believed in, smiling at the tapestry of unity they had woven from his tattered letters. Eventually, the time came to say their farewells again. This time, the parting felt less sorrowful, more like "see you soon." They had built a future from the ashes of the past. Emma and Margaret flew home with full hearts. The desk in the study remained their symbolic anchor, a place to pen new letters, each carrying forward the spirit of bridging distances once deemed insurmountable. In the quiet weeks that followed, as they resumed daily routines, Margaret occasionally drifted to the desk, writing postcards to Lynn or notes to Min about American traditions, scanning old photos to share. Emma, in a sense, found her father again through the life he had left behind. She felt her own regrets ease. She realized that while Jim's choice to remain silent caused decades of pain, it also led them to a profound journey of reconciliation. Thus, the unsent letters found their recipients, albeit too late for Jim to witness. But perhaps that was never the point. The letters were seeds planted by a man desperate for redemption. The fruit they bore was the love that connected 2 families, bridging oceans and decades. Each letter changed hands, breathing life into relationships once consigned to memory. One crisp autumn afternoon, Emma concluded the novel she had been writing in her head for years. Her father's story, Lynn's unwavering hope, Min's half-lost childhood, and Margaret's heartbreak that transformed into understanding. She typed the final words, tears slipping down her cheeks. It was not a novel for publication, but a tribute to the power of words, never spoken words that, when finally shared, lit the path toward healing. She printed a copy to send to Min, hoping he would see how deeply she honored their father's life. Later, mother and daughter strolled around the neighborhood, leaves crunching underfoot, the sky brilliant with the setting sun. Margaret mentioned that she dreamed of Jim the previous night. He was in his uniform, smiling at them from a distance, as though finally at peace. Emma believed it was no coincidence. In every letter, in every gesture of unity across the ocean, Jim's spirit found rest. They returned home, the porch light glowing softly. Emma paused at the threshold, a tender smile on her lips, remembering the day she first discovered the letters. How drastically life had changed since then. She breathed in the crisp air, quietly thanked her father for leading her on this journey. With that, she and Margaret stepped inside, the door closing on the twilight. But the letters, once hidden, now soared across continents, weaving a narrative of regret turned into reunion, sorrow turned into solace. No one could rewrite the past, but through a single letter never sent, and then a dozen more, two families had discovered an unbreakable bond. And in that revelation, they discovered that love, no matter how belated, could stitch together even the most wounded hearts. Jim Taylor's legacy lived on, not in the anguish he carried, but in the love he left behind, finally unbound, finally home. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.